Today I've built a simple appointment application using the Volt framework. It didn't take me a very long amount of time to complete this application, and one of the main reasons that it didn't take long was that I was able to reuse something called a Volt component from another Volt user who shared it into the Volt component ecosystem. So a Volt component is basically a way to break your code down into smaller pieces, and it also has functionality built in so that you can automatically publish the component onto Ruby gems and share it with other users. That's the big win with open source, and Volt does a good job of allowing you to both share and keep your code modular. When Volt users publish a component, it is automatically preceded by the word Volt. This makes it easy to search for the component that meets your project's needs. In today's example, I'm going to use the Volt Date Picker gem. It's a good choice because it's an officially maintained gem and it's great at what it does. You can use it for any project that needs a calendar widget. Before we start, let's talk about what a component actually is. A component can best be thought of as a small application living inside of a larger application. Components can be packaged into shareable Ruby gems, which creates the Volt ecosystem that I'm talking about today. Within your app folder, you're going to have subfolders inside of the app directory. Each of those subfolders of the app folder is a component. By default, Volt loads a component called main, which comes with every project. From component main, you include smaller subcomponents. That's what we're going to learn today. The project in our example needed some base scaffolding, so I've added that in the repo you see here. If you'd like to follow along at home, you can follow these directions in the README. This will bring you to a starting point, and then you can build the application from there. The first step to get started is to add the Volt Date Picker gem to your gem file. After you update the gem file, you can run bundle install to fetch all the dependencies. Now we're inside of dependencies.rb within the application main component. We need to add the following line to dependencies.rb. The component method that we're calling here is specific to the Volt framework. What does the component command actually do, though? Volt components, including the main application component, use dependencies.rb as a means of declaring all of the subcomponents needed to render the page. You can also include URLs for JavaScript and CSS files that are hosted elsewhere on a CDN. I'm not going to cover that for today, but it's something to keep in mind as your application grows. For more information, see the Volt documentation. As we see here, the date picker component uses a view tag to expose its functionality. This tag will dynamically insert the date picker HTML into the page. But what about this attribute right here? It's a two-way data binding that stores and retrieves the date object based on the user's input, basically what they click on the calendar. We're going to bind this to a temporary model called date, which is stored inside of a page collection. That means that if we refresh the page, the date will reset itself to nil, which is desirable in our use case. Let's start writing the code for our views. One last thing before we get started. If you didn't understand what a view tag was in that last scene, check out episode 3 where I built a card game using Volt views, tags, and model controllers. That'll give you a better understanding of what's going on. When you finish that one, you can come back. The HTML scene here is just boilerplate. We need to add the following code: a date picker view tag and an input element. As you see here, I'm storing some temporary models on the page store. Eventually, that's going to be persisted inside of HTML5 local storage, though. Within this form element right here, I want the button to save a new appointment and clear the form when I submit it. I can do that by adding an eSubmit binding to the form. Event bindings are a way of calling controller methods when a particular DOM event fires. In this case, the submit event on the form tag. This particular eSubmit binding is going to call addAppointment within our controller. We haven't written that method yet, so let's do it now. I would also like to remind new Volt users that our current controller is actually running on the front end. If you ever need to access the server from your controller code, take a look at episode 1 where I cover task objects. Within the controller, I will define a method called addAppointment. Since this is an HTML5 local storage app, I need to initialize an empty collection inside the local store called appointments. If you try to access a pluralized attribute that doesn't exist on a store such as local store, Volt assumes that you want a collection object and will initialize a new one for you. That's why you don't see me creating an empty collection or an empty array anywhere in this controller. After that, we can append our form data to the collection. When you append a hash to a collection in Volt, it automatically gets converted into a model. Lastly, we need to clear the form. Changing the value of a model in a controller also changes the HTML in our view. So in this case, I can put in an empty string and it's going to clear out the HTML form. Now that we can create new appointments inside of the controller, we need a way of viewing them in the HTML. We can do that using a straightforward syntax for iterating over collections. It's very similar to ERB, but it's worth noting that this is happening on the front end. This is not back-end rendering like you might be used to in other frameworks. We also need some vanilla HTML for our templates, and we can interpolate model data using the same syntax as you see here. To destroy an appointment, I'm using the eClick binding and calling the destroy method on the appointment model itself. Now we can fire up the server to see if it worked. Okay, looks good. As you see, Volt components make it easy for you to reuse code. I hope you have enjoyed today's video, and please consider subscribing to our blog at datamelon.io. Leave us a comment if you have questions or feedback.